Our final episode takes us back east. Join us as we explore Asia, from the Indian subcontinent to post-war Japan, Korea, and more. If you'd like to see any of these regions before the war, check out these videos. As mentioned last episode, the World War sparked decolonization in Africa and the Middle East. Asia was no different. The British Raj maintained control on the subcontinent. Overall, the British Raj had quite an extensive reach, having at one point administered Burma, the Strait settlements, including their important territories of Malacca and Singapore, British Somaliland, and holding influence over the Persian Gulf Residency, including the states of Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar. But the most significant of the British Raj domains was India. We tend to think of the British Raj as synonymous with British India, but the latter only refers to the regions directly controlled by the Crown. Those ruled indirectly, through native princes, were called princely states. When we had last left India, we saw the burgeoning of nationalist movements against colonial rule. But like in Africa and the Middle East, the movements themselves were often in disharmony. Some wanted reform, others wanted total independence. Many were Hindu, some Muslim. As a religious minority, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, sought out the creation of an independent Muslim nation. These demands were made official in the Lahore Resolution in 1940. World War II exacerbated economic hardships in British India, including inflation, food shortages, and unemployment. The Bengal famine of 1943 indirectly played a significant role in exacerbating Hindu-Muslim tensions as communities competed for scarce resources. Resentment grew between Hindu landlords and Muslim peasants, as landlords were often accused of hoarding food or exploiting famine conditions for profit. The British colonial administration as well was widely criticised for its failure to prevent or alleviate the famine. After World War II, Britain was economically and politically weakened, and its ability to govern India effectively diminished. Calls for independence emerged once again, even stronger than before. The divide between Hindu and Muslim deepened, and clashes grew more brutal. The new Labour government in Britain was opposed to the continued colonial presence. After the economic drain of the war, an inability to deal with the violence between Hindu and Muslim, Prime Minister Clement Attlee declared British India was to become an independent state. The Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 proposed a federal structure with autonomy for provinces and safeguards for minority rights. Initially, it was accepted by both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, but disagreements over the implementation led to the plan's failure. On Direct Action Day, a day the Muslim League pressed for the creation of their new state, communal violence erupted in the Great Calcutta Killings. Over 4,000 were killed and tens of thousands injured, deepening Hindu-Muslim animosity. Animosity with the British had always been just as present and deteriorated rapidly after the Royal Indian Navy mutiny. Much of the Hindu-Muslim divide had been exacerbated in previous decades by the British in accordance with their strategy of divide and rule, more commonly known as divide and conquer. As the Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten was tasked with overseeing the transition to independence. He proposed the partition of British India into two dominions, India and Pakistan, based on religious majorities, with the provinces of Bengal and Punjab to be divided accordingly. While leaders like the INC's Nehru accepted partition as a pragmatic solution to communal tensions, some, including Mahatma Gandhi, opposed it on the grounds of national unity. The British decision to partition India, announced in June 1947, triggered fears of displacement and minority persecution in both Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority areas. The process of dividing the provinces of Punjab and Bengal, which had mixed populations, created intense competition for territorial control. These regions would experience severe communal violence. On August 15 at midnight, the partition was officially triggered. What followed was unprecedented chaos, mass killings, sexual violence, and destruction of property, with estimates of 1 to 2 million deaths. Partition led to one of the largest mass migrations in history, with approximately 14 to 18 million people crossing borders, as large-scale efforts were made by each community to cleanse areas of the other religion. Trains carrying refugees were attacked, leaving carriages filled with dead bodies. Some princely states, like Kashmir, were in a precarious position, as it had a predominantly Muslim population, ruled over by a Hindu prince. Soon, war broke out over this region. With partition, the Dominion of Pakistan was created, meaning the land of the pure. It comprised two geographically and culturally separate regions, East and West Pakistan, with an Islamic identity framework. Under the INC, the Dominion of India was led by Prime Minister Nehru. They adopted a secular democratic framework, integrating diverse linguistic, cultural, and religious communities. But some states resisted integration, necessitating a mix of diplomacy and, in rare cases, military intervention, like in Hyderabad. Kashmir, under Maharaja Hari Singh, a Hindu, ruled over a majority Muslim population and attempted to remain independent. But in October 1947, Lashkar militias invaded, aiming to annex the majority Muslim Kashmir to Pakistan. In response, the Maharaja sought military assistance from his Hindu neighbors, legally binding Kashmir to India.
When Pakistan began aiding the Muslim forces, full-scale war involving hundreds of millions of people, a catastrophe many had predicted with dread, seemed about to become a reality.
Gandhi, the pacifist, couldn't even escape the violence.
Mahatma Gandhi is dead.
He was assassinated in January 1948 by a Hindu nationalist who resented Gandhi's opposition to a Hindu state. After a ceasefire in early 1949, the line of control, or LOC, was drawn to establish a boundary. The LOC became a highly militarized border between the two countries, fueling long-lasting tensions over the region.
The day India became a republic within the Commonwealth was certainly historic. Beneath portraits of Gandhi and Mr. Nehru, the High Commissioner, Mr. Krishna Menon, read the proclamation at India House.
India, that is Bharat, shall be a sovereign democratic republic.
On January 26, 1950, India adopted its constitution, declaring itself a sovereign, socialist, democratic republic. The constitution guaranteed protections for all Indians, whether Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh, and protected against discrimination based on race, sex, or caste. India is so diverse, it does not have a single national language, but it does have two official languages at the union or federal level. Hindi was the most common, and English was common among elites, while 22 scheduled languages enjoyed official recognition. Nehru believed that socialism, with an emphasis on state-led industrialization, was the best way of ending the poverty and unemployment in his state. This was done through 5-year plans. The first focused on agricultural development and irrigation projects, but it remained a moderate success, as land reforms were resisted and there was not enough equipment or fertilizer for those working the land. But it laid the ground for subsequent plans focused on industrialization, with the establishment of steel plants, heavy machinery industries, and infrastructure projects like dams and highways. There remained a balance between state-owned enterprises and smaller private businesses. India remained unaligned during the Cold War, and Nehru was a co-founder of the non-aligned movement, seeking to provide guidance to other newly independent nations in Africa and Asia.
Jawaharlal Nehru, chief minister of his country since India became independent in 1947, died at the age of 74. Neither on the political stage nor in moral stature was his leadership ever challenged.
After Nehru's death in 1964, he was succeeded by Lal Bahadur Shastri, known for his simplicity, integrity, and dedication to public service. His Green Revolution promoted agricultural productivity to combat food shortages, introducing disease-resistant grains and rice, while the White Revolution boosted the production of milk. In 1965, Pakistan conducted a covert operation in Kashmir to entice an insurgency against India. But this led to another short but costly war in 1965, which produced the largest tank battle since the World War until that point, at the Battle of Chawinda. Shastri passed away on January 11, 1966, a day after the end of the war, under circumstances that remain subject to speculation. He would be remembered for the slogan, "Hail the soldier, hail the farmer," emphasizing the importance of both the military and agriculture. Indira Gandhi, daughter of Nehru, and no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, became the third Prime Minister in 1966. She continued and expanded agricultural reforms to make India self-sufficient in food grains. Green Army initiatives focused on rural development and poverty alleviation, and she strengthened the central government's authority, sometimes at the expense of states' autonomy. Chinese forces had already advanced into territories claimed by India in 1962, seeking access to Aksai Chin, the only year-long accessible route from Xinjiang to Tibet. In 1967, Gandhi oversaw another brief conflict with her northern neighbor, expelling an invasion into the Himalayas from China and annexing the Kingdom of Sikkim, at this point a British protectorate strategically nestled between India, Bhutan, Tibet, and Nepal. A few years later, Gandhi saw violence once again, this time in East Pakistan. Riots broke out against Pakistani rule, and India intervened on the side of Bengali nationalists. In less than 2 weeks, Pakistani forces surrendered, and East Pakistan broke away to become the independent state of Bangladesh. Under Gandhi's strong leadership, India became the most powerful nation on the subcontinent. But in 1975, she declared a state of emergency, citing internal disturbances.
The opposition was becoming undemocratic, unconstitutional. What was threatened was the very stability and unity of India.
This was most likely because of her mounting problems in the judicial system and pressure from other political leaders. In response, Gandhi curtailed civil liberties, censored the press, and arrested opposition. To stem the population boom, she adopted a controversial family planning initiative, which led to forced sterilizations.
Is it really necessary to force parents to be sterilized after they've had 2 or 3 children?
At this moment, we can feed our population, but if the population keeps on growing as it is, in some years it will be impossible to look after it.
In the end, Gandhi faced an eventual electoral loss in 1977, the first time the Congress Party was defeated. A minority government was formed by Morarji Desai as Prime Minister. As a peace activist, he restored relations with China and Pakistan, but his government was ineffective, and by 1980, Indira Gandhi and the Congress Party were back in power. Partition gave Muslims and Hindus their own respective states. But what about the Sikhs? The majority of Sikhs lived in the Punjab, on the borders of Pakistan and India. Calls to form a sovereign Sikh state, called Khalistan, had been around since the 1930s, but it reached its zenith after Bangladesh was successful in its fight for independence. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Sikh leader Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale gained influence among certain sections of Punjab's Sikh community. He led an insurgency that included attacks on civilians and law enforcement, using the Golden Temple complex as a base of operations. Prime Minister Gandhi, newly re-elected, viewed the escalating militancy as a serious threat to national security and unity. Efforts to negotiate a peaceful solution failed, and the decision was made to use military force. The immediate goal was to assert control over the Golden Temple complex and capture or eliminate Bhindranwale and his key associates. But removing armed militants from such a sacred site was a daunting task that could alienate the entire Sikh population. Nonetheless, the operation began on June 1, 1984, and intensified during the week. Indian Army troops, including special forces, were deployed around and inside the Golden Temple complex. They were all instructed to minimize harm to the temple. But the heavy exchange of gunfire led to significant damage to the complex's structures. The militants themselves were also well armed and fortified, and the operation dragged on. Official figures vary, but hundreds of people, including militants, soldiers, and civilians, were killed or wounded during the assault. The Akal Takht, one of the highest seats of Sikh religious authority within the temple complex, was heavily damaged by gunfire and artillery. The use of force and desecration of the holiest shrine of Sikhism outraged Sikhs not just in India, but those worldwide. On October 31st, 2 of Gandhi's Sikh bodyguards assassinated her, allegedly in retaliation for the military operation. But in a never-ending circle of violence, her death sparked anti-Sikh riots, leading to the killing of thousands of Sikhs in Delhi and other parts of northern India. Tensions and violence in the region persisted throughout the 1980s and early 90s, until operations eventually reduced the insurgency. But issues of trust between the government and sections of the Sikh populace took years to begin healing. The Congress Party continued with the Nehru-Gandhi family. Indira Gandhi was succeeded by her son Rajiv. Rajiv Gandhi, a professional airline pilot, had reluctantly entered the world of politics after his brother, a member of parliament, died in a plane crash. After his mother's assassination, he was made prime minister the same day, at the age of 40. Despite this, he stayed apolitical, without strong ideological positions. As a result, government took a backseat to private enterprise, and he decentralized power to local governments, quite a contrast from the governance of Jawaharlal and Indira. Foreshadowing the broader liberalization of the 1990s, he took steps toward reducing red tape, liberalizing imports, and encouraging foreign investment. In 1987, he intervened in a civil war to the south. The Sri Lankan Civil War had been raging between the Sinhalese Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers, rebels seeking to form a separate state, Tamil Eelam. After signing the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, he deployed peacekeeping forces, a move that soon became controversial due to rising casualties and local opposition. The Boffa scandal of 1987, combined with growing dissent against economic and social policies, led to a significant drop in Congress's popularity. Gandhi's Congress lost its parliamentary majority in the 1989 elections, and during the 1991 election campaign, Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated by a suicide bomber associated with the Tamil Tigers. His death altered India's political landscape, as the nation's future was to be guided by the Nehru-Gandhi family, no longer. The Congress Party went into decline, and its secular, mixed economy policies gave way to a Hindu party focused on cultural nationalism and pro-market reforms. This was the BJP. A.B. Vajpayee became the first non-Congress Prime Minister to serve a full term, from 1998 to 2004, leading India into the new millennium. Since then, the Congress and BJP have alternated governments, experiencing corruption, but also rapid economic growth, particularly in the technology and service sectors, transforming India into one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. Economic inequality is still a major issue, though, and some see the country as two Indias, with a privileged minority of educated urban elites in the middle of hundreds of millions of poor rural peasants. But India's major current problems are environmental in nature, as land becomes more unusable and droughts more frequent. Unlike India, Pakistan was envisioned to be a secular state for Muslims, but underwent significant Islamization. At partition, Pakistan encompassed two large distinct territories, separated by thousands of miles. Check out this video to find out how the demographics of these regions became associated with Islam. East Pakistan contained the majority of the population. They were predominantly Bengali, living along the rich wet Ganges Delta, cultivating rice in what became the land of rivers. Despite East Pakistan having a larger population, political and administrative power was concentrated in West Pakistan's urban centers, notably in cities like Karachi, Lahore, and later Islamabad. This left the East feeling alienated. West Pakistan, centered around the West Punjab and Indus, often struggled with drought. It remains ethnically diverse, with Punjabis in the Punjab and Sindhis in the Sindh to the south. Pashtuns, with ties to the dominant population in Afghanistan, also lived along the borders, and the Baluch lived along the borders of Iran. Punjabis were, and continue to be, the largest ethnic group in West Pakistan. The emphasis on Urdu as the sole national language created linguistic and cultural tensions in East Pakistan, where the vast majority spoke Bengali. Led by Governor-General Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the new state had growing pains, facing a massive refugee crisis, administrative hurdles, and financial constraints. Pakistan operated as a dominion until its first constitution was adopted in 1956, establishing itself as an Islamic republic. Pakistan has experienced long periods of military rule, with the military staging coups in 1958, 1977, and 1999. Post-2001, Pakistan aligned with the US in the fight against terrorism, receiving aid but facing domestic backlash from both Islamist groups and secularists who saw the regime as too authoritarian. The border regions with Afghanistan had become important in the last decades, as there was a search for al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. Amid increasing calls for democracy, Benazir Bhutto, a secular former prime minister, returned to Pakistan to run in the 2008 elections, but was assassinated. Pressure against military rule reached a boiling point, and General Pervez Musharraf resigned as president. Bhutto's surviving husband, Asif Ali Zardari, became the new president, as Pakistan remains under civilian rule with a parliamentary democracy. Straddling the distant eastern reaches of the subcontinent, between South and Southeast Asia, was Burma. Much of Southeast Asia had been occupied by the Japanese and absorbed into their empire, but before that, had been European colonies. After the war, as in South Asia, the British Labour government promoted decolonization efforts. Burma gained full independence on January 4, 1948, becoming a parliamentary democracy and the next British colony in Asia to achieve sovereignty. Later in the year, just to the east, the Federation of Malaya was established, granting limited self-governance.
Across Malaya stretches the jungle, bright with orchids, loud with the song of birds and the chatter of monkeys, and infested with communist guerrillas who terrorize the rubber estates hacked out of this wilderness.
At the same time, a communist-led insurgency, known as the Malayan Emergency to the British, was suppressed. But it led to negotiations with non-communist Malay leaders, particularly Tunku Abdul Rahman, leading to independence in 1957. Continuing the decolonization trend, the United States granted independence to the Philippines, but still maintained political, economic, and military influence. The French colonial presence in Southeast Asia was concentrated in French Indochina, comprising Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. But the French were less supportive of decolonization, and after the Viet Minh declared independence, war broke out in 1946. You can watch it all in this video, with full colorized footage. This First Indochina War ended with the Geneva Accords in 1954, leading to the partition of Vietnam into the Communist North Vietnam and anti-Communist South Vietnam, and marked the end of French colonial rule. North Vietnam remained under Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, while the South also became authoritarian under pro-Western President Ngo Dinh Diem. Laos had gained full independence, reinstating its monarchy in 1953, though it faced internal struggles between royalists, right-wing factions, and the communist Pathet Lao. Following negotiations with France, Cambodia also declared independence as a monarchy under King Norodom Sihanouk. Like the French, the Dutch were also unwilling to withdraw from their primary possession. The Dutch East Indies, which comprised thousands of islands, including Java, Sumatra, and Borneo, After the Japanese occupation, nationalist leaders Sukarno and Mohammed Hatta declared Indonesia's independence on August 17, 1945. But the Dutch attempted to regain control, leading to a sporadic multi-year struggle, the Indonesian National Revolution. International pressure followed, including from the United States, who threatened to withhold Marshall Plan aid to the Netherlands. The Dutch promptly entered negotiations. By 1950, the nationalists had won their independence, with Sukarno as president of the new Republic of Indonesia. By the 1960s, many of these newly independent nations faced significant political challenges. The Union of Burma, primarily led by Prime Minister U Nu, was a parliamentary democracy focused on Buddhism and embraced elements of socialism. A military coup in 1962 brought General Ne Win to power, who established a socialist totalitarian dictatorship that isolated the country from the global stage for decades. It kept an emphasis on Buddhist values and traditional culture as part of national identity, but economic living standards became catastrophic. Ne Win was known for being quite superstitious, practicing yadaya, rituals to stave off misfortune. In 1987, after reportedly consulting with an astrologer who told him the number 9 would lead to success, he demonetized large currency bills, replacing them with only 45 and 90, as both numerals added up to, and were divisible by 9, while millions lost their life savings in the process. The Kingdom of Siam, which had changed its name to Thailand in 1939 during a wave of nationalism, had avoided Western colonization but became a pro-US ally during the Cold War. The kingdom focused on infrastructure and tourism to boost its economy, for the most part remaining under military rule in the face of communist neighbors. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Malaya had a majority Malay population, but the Chinese population was also significant, particularly in urban and commercial centers. Chinese political groups formed coalitions with Indian groups to garner more representation, but the Malayan government sought to maintain its own political dominance. The inclusion of North Borneo and Sarawak, with their largely indigenous and Malay majority populations, was seen as a way to ensure that Malays and other indigenous groups remained politically dominant within the federation. Singapore also joined the federation. Despite its majority Chinese population, the economic and security benefits of uniting outweighed these concerns over its Chinese majority. This decision, though, was contentious and carried long-term risks. The federal government in Kuala Lumpur and the Chinese-led government in Singapore often clashed. In 1964, racial tensions escalated into riots, during which ethnic clashes between Malays and Chinese led to loss of lives and heightened mistrust. It was clear the federation could not work long-term without changes or concessions. To resolve the growing tensions and safeguard Malay political dominance, Tunku Abdul Rahman and the Malaysian government decided to expel Singapore from the federation in 1965, leading to its independence. Indonesia's political landscape was highly fragmented as well, with numerous parties representing different ideological, ethnic, and religious interests. But President Sukarno was instrumental in uniting Indonesians under a common national identity. He even risked war with Malaysia over aspirations of a greater Indonesia, arguing that the Malay Peninsula had historically been part of the old empires of Srivijaya or Majapahit. He strongly opposed the formation of Malaysia, viewing it as a neo-colonial project, especially since their borders now touched on the island of Borneo. The Konfrontasi, or confrontation, was Indonesia's campaign to prevent its formation, involving covert military and paramilitary incursions into Malaysian territories. The instability of the parliamentary system and regional rebellions convinced Sukarno to advocate for guided democracy, which had given Sukarno a more authoritarian system that concentrated power in his hands. In September 1965, a failed coup known as the 30th of September movement was allegedly led by the PKI, the Communist Party, notable for being the largest communist party in the world. But the military, under military officer Suharto's leadership, quickly moved to suppress the coup. In the aftermath, anti-communist purges took place, resulting in the mass killing of alleged communists and sympathizers, with estimates of deaths ranging from 500,000 to 1 million. Suharto gradually consolidated power, and by 1967, Sukarno was formally removed from office. This marked the beginning of the New Order era. Suharto established a highly centralized, authoritarian regime, with power concentrated in his hands. His regime relied on a system of military-backed control known as dwufunctie, or dual function, and corruption to maintain power. Guided democracy, which had been introduced by Sukarno, was replaced with the Pancasila, the 5 principles of Indonesian state philosophy, used by Suharto as a central ideological tool during his administration. Suharto shifted away from Sukarno's socialist policies, implementing a series of market-oriented economic reforms, attracting foreign investment from the United States and other Western countries. Indonesia's economy saw significant growth, especially in oil, gas, and mineral exports, with substantial investments in infrastructure, agriculture, and industry. During this period, Suharto's government was highly focused on national unity and suppressed various ethnic and religious movements that were seen as threats to this unity. After Portugal's wave of decolonization in 1975, Indonesia invaded their former colony of East Timor, leading to a decades-long conflict. The invasion led to widespread human rights abuses. Estimates suggest that up to 200,000 East Timorese, about a quarter of the population, died as a result of violence, famine, and forced labor during the occupation. The tiny Roman Catholic nation would finally gain independence in 2002. Suharto also faced several separatist movements, but these were suppressed with military force. His regime maintained strong ties with Western powers, especially the United States, who supported his anti-communist stance during the Cold War, and was seen as a reliable ally in the region. In 1997, an Asian financial crisis hit Indonesia hard, causing economic collapse, soaring inflation, unemployment, and widespread poverty. The rupiah, the national currency, plummeted in value, and many large businesses and banks collapsed. Amid mounting protests, political pressure, and a loss of support from the military and political allies, Suharto resigned on May 21, 1998, after over 3 decades in power. His resignation marked the beginning of Indonesia's transition to a more democratic system known as the Reformation era.
Authorized and directed by the President of the United States to proclaim the independence of the Philippines as a separate and self-governing nation.
The Philippines, now independent from the United States, maintained close ties and initially experienced a surge in economic growth. Once Ferdinand Marcos took power, he scrapped democracy in favor of martial law in 1973. Thousands of political opponents, activists, and journalists were arrested, tortured, or disappeared during the martial law period.
I pray now and I ask you to pray with me, as I prayed 8 years ago, that we are doing the right thing by our people. For the end of martial law does not mean the end of our efforts, of our needed reforms.
Marcos officially ended martial law in 1981, but continued to rule through authoritarian measures. A prominent opposition leader, Benigno Aquino Jr., or Ninoy, was assassinated upon return from exile in 1983. After a decade of martial law, this tipping point sparked massive protests and international condemnation. Marcos called a snap election in 1986, facing Corazon Cory Aquino, Ninoy Aquino's widow, as the opposition candidate.
I hereby proclaim Ferdinand E. Marcos as the duly elected president.
Widespread electoral fraud triggered the People Power Revolution, a peaceful uprising which forced Marcos to evacuate the country in February 1986, ending his 21-year rule. Aquino, the first female president of the Philippines, restored democratic governance by abolishing Marcos's authoritarian constitution and introducing a new one in 1987. But though Marcos was gone, his loyalists remained, and Aquino faced multiple coup attempts from disgruntled factions of the military, including the 1989 attempt, which nearly toppled her government. Despite these threats, Aquino retained support from the United States and the Filipino public. Marcos remains a controversial figure, while Aquino is remembered for her peaceful governance and commitment to democratic principles. After the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, the Vietnam War ended, and Vietnam was reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in 1976, with Hanoi as its capital. The communist government implemented collectivization of agriculture and nationalized industries in both the North and the newly integrated South. Policies aimed at eradicating capitalism in the South led to economic disruption, mass unemployment, and the forced relocation of millions to new economic zones. As hundreds of thousands fled persecution and poverty, they became refugees, the Vietnamese boat people, a crisis that lasted for 20 years. After the First Indochina War, Laos and Cambodia had won their independence alongside Vietnam. But these remained as monarchies and quickly fell into authoritarianism. During the Second Indochina War, more commonly known as the Vietnam War, the two countries became severely destabilized. Cambodia's monarchy was abolished in a coup and replaced with the US-aligned Khmer Republic. At the end of the war, when North Vietnam captured Saigon, in 1975, the communist Pathet Lao overthrew the monarchy and established the Lao People's Democratic Republic, or LPDR. Laos became heavily dependent on Vietnam for military and political support, aligning itself closely with Hanoi's policies. In Cambodia, the short-lived republic fell to the Khmer Rouge. Under Pol Pot, the communists seized Phnom Penh in 1975 and established democratic Kampuchea. The regime sought to create a radical agrarian communist society, forcing urban populations into rural communes and abolishing money, religion, and private property. Between 1.5 and 2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population, died from starvation, forced labor, executions, and disease during the Khmer Rouge's reign, the Cambodian genocide. The Khmer Rouge conducted brutal raids into Vietnamese border villages, killing thousands of civilians. Notably, the Ba Chuk massacre in April 1978 saw over 3,000 Vietnamese civilians slaughtered. Though both were communist, the Khmer Rouge adhered to an extreme version of Maoism and forcibly rejected any Vietnamese influence, both within their borders and without. Vietnam, though, became pro-Soviet, eroding relations with China. Throughout 1977 and 1978, skirmishes between Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge forces intensified, leading to mounting casualties and insecurity, and eventually war. In 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and quickly overthrew the Khmer Rouge, installing a new government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea. Cambodia, and Laos under the Pathet Lao, came under Vietnam's sphere of influence. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge retreated to the Thai border and waged a guerrilla insurgency with support from China and Western powers, including the US, who opposed the occupation by the Soviet-aligned Vietnam. Years of conflict left Cambodia devastated, with millions of refugees and landmines littering the countryside. The occupation lasted a decade, and a comprehensive peace agreement was signed in 1991. Cambodia held its first multi-party elections in 1993, resulting in a coalition government. An aged Pol Pot was found and placed under house arrest in 1998, but died soon after, possibly a suicide. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, was formed in 1967 by Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand to promote regional cooperation, economic growth, and to contain the spread of communism. By the 1990s, many ASEAN nations experienced rapid industrialization and economic expansion. Cambodia stabilized under Hun Sen's leadership, while Vietnam implemented economic reforms called Doi Moi, meaning renovation, transitioning to a socialist-oriented market economy. They joined ASEAN in 1996. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, emanating from Thailand, severely impacted several Asian economies, hitting South Korea and Indonesia the hardest. Compared to Africa and the Middle East, which we went over last episode, Southeast Asia has stabilized in recent decades and has integrated well into the global economic community. Time will tell whether the success continues. While Southeast Asia rebuilt its economies after the war, to the north, another rapid industrial boom reshaped the region. In 1945, the land of the rising sun turned into the land of rising flame and fury. The Second World War became a turning point, and Japan's vast empire was dissolved. Hirohito's domain was placed under the occupation of the Allied powers, led by the United States and directed by General Douglas MacArthur. The occupation aimed to demilitarize, democratize, and rebuild Japan. Under MacArthur, the Allied administration dismantled Japan's armed forces, and the production of military equipment was banned. In 1947, a new constitution replaced the old Meiji Constitution of 1890, establishing a parliamentary system and guaranteed civil liberties and universal suffrage. Land reforms reduced rural inequality and labor laws promoted workers' rights. The new constitution also enshrined Article 9, renouncing war and the use of offensive military force. Prominent Japanese leaders were tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal for crimes against humanity. 7 leaders, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were executed. To ensure political stability, Hirohito, the emperor and face of the old empire, was neither executed nor was he even tried. He was allowed to remain emperor, but was forced to abandon the ancient claim of divinity associated with the Japanese emperors. But Japan's economy was still in shambles. Cities, industries, and infrastructure were devastated by Allied bombings, while food shortages and inflation created widespread poverty. The zaibatsu, the big business conglomerates, were broken up and more power was given to labor unions, while lowering the state's involvement in the economy. The zaibatsu were closely tied to Japan's militarism and directly profited off the war, so dismantling them was part of the effort to prevent future military aggression. Shares from Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and the other largest zaibatsu were confiscated and sold to the public. With the outbreak of the Cold War, the United States shifted focus from dismantling Japan's economic structure to rebuilding it as a bulwark against communism. Many former zaibatsu companies reorganized into keiretsu, which were loose networks of interrelated companies centered around a main bank instead of powerful families. The Allied occupation officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco on September 8, 1951, which came into effect in 1952.
It remains only for Japan to sign, and there is a hush as Mr. Yoshida brings the conference to a successful conclusion. If leniency has been shown, it is with the will of 48 nations in their search for peace and security. May the future justify their faith.
Japan regained full sovereignty and entered into a security alliance with the United States. Given Japan's renunciation of war, the United States was allowed to maintain bases there. The Korean War, which we discussed here, greatly boosted Japan's economy, as it became a key supplier of goods and logistics for the US military. Government played a central role in guiding economic development through industrial policy and targeted investments. Similar to the boom of the Meiji era, Japan entered another era of growth best described as miraculous. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, directed resources to strategic industries such as steel, electronics, and automobiles. High tariffs and state-sponsored incentives protected domestic industries. Japan focused on importing technology and improving it to produce high-quality goods for export. A strong work ethic was reciprocated with lifelong employment. By the 1960s, Japan became a global leader in many industries, exporting products like Sony electronics, Toyota cars, and Nikon cameras. Japan's GDP grew at an average annual rate of 10% during the 1950s and 1960s, the Japanese economic miracle. By the 1970s, the once powerful nation had regained its prestige, becoming the second largest economy in the world after the United States, larger than both Britain and France combined. The average urban citizen lived a life similar to those in Europe and the United States. After the war, new political parties formed, as the old ones had been merged into an imperial association that was now dissolved. The Japan Socialist Party initially became the largest party, benefiting from widespread anti-war sentiment and discontent with the pre-war militarism that had taken hold. Conservatives were divided between the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party, which competed for dominance in the early post-war years. But in 1955, both parties merged to form the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, creating a powerful, unified conservative bloc. This brought the LDP into power, overseeing almost 30 years of prosperity. The LDP maintained close ties with big businesses, ensuring economic growth, and supported the US-Japan alliance, which provided security while allowing them to focus on economic development. The rapid industrialization led to significant urban migration. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama expanded overnight. An emphasis on education created a skilled and disciplined workforce, and Japan developed one of the highest literacy rates and academic achievement levels in the world. Social problems persisted, like the former ETA, now known as Burakumin, faced discrimination socially and economically. Many Burakumin faced difficulty accessing education, employment, and housing. The Ainu, an indigenous group from Hokkaido, have also long faced cultural and economic marginalization. Many Koreans, forcibly brought over during Japan's colonial rule over the old Chosun state, also faced discrimination, lacking official citizenship, and remained underrepresented in politics and public life. Some Japanese political groups have attempted to downplay or deny wartime atrocities, such as the Nanjing massacre and the issue of comfort women, those primarily from Korea and China, who were forced to work in military brothels. This has strained Japan's relations with its neighbors. In the 1980s, speculative investments in real estate and stocks fueled a massive asset bubble. At the peak of the bubble, some valuations were so high, they placed Tokyo as being worth more than the entirety of the United States. But by the end of the decade, the bubble burst dramatically. By the 1990s, Japan's economic miracle had fallen from grace. The burst triggered deflation, a banking crisis, and economic stagnation, with many banks saddled with non-performing loans and corporations unable to recover their losses. The surge in value of the yen crippled exports and caused companies to hold on to cash instead of invest. Without a robust domestic market, partially because of Japan's aging population and declining birth rates, the economy stalled. The culture of lifetime appointments to employees reduced a company's ability to downsize. To boost economic activity, the government launched numerous stimulus packages and funded large public works. But these measures contributed to a ballooning national debt, which became one of the highest in the world, at over 200% of GDP. Nowadays, the lost decade is sometimes referred to in the plural, as Japan's economy continues to stagnate. The decline of Japan allowed for the growing prominence of China, which had implemented Dengist economic reforms in 1978, transforming it into a global manufacturing hub by the 90s. But following Japan's miracle, there were others who sought the same economic success. These were the Asian tigers, or four dragons. As Japan had to recover from World War II, South Korea had to recover from both the decades-long Japanese occupation and the ensuing Korean War. After the war, North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, initially experienced growth with a state-controlled economy. Here, the hammer and sickle are accompanied by a brush, symbolizing the unity of the working class, peasants, and intellectuals. Together, these symbols represent the three integral parts of their revolutionary movement, upholding the state ideology of Juche, or self-reliance. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to a severe economic crisis, and combined with mismanagement and natural disasters, resulted in a dire famine, killing hundreds of thousands. Kim Jong-il took power in 1994 after his father's death, and introduced the military-first, or Songun policy, prioritizing the army over economic reforms. North Korea has been ruled by Kim Jong-un since 2011, but the country remains politically isolated, economically devastated, and reliant on China for food and energy. As North Korea entrenched itself in the communist world, South Korea maintained strong alliances with the United States, relying on their aid for reconstruction after the Korean War. President Syngman Rhee, South Korea's first leader, ruled with an authoritarian grip, focused on maintaining security against North Korea, which continued to be ruled by Kim Il-sung. South Korea remained one of the poorest countries in the world during this period, with limited industrialization and dependence on agriculture. Rhee's rule became increasingly corrupt and repressive, including electoral fraud, which sparked mass protests. This April Revolution forced Rhee to resign and flee into exile. After Rhee's resignation, South Korea established its first democratic government, the Second Republic. Led by Chang Myon as Prime Minister, South Korea was still unable to address the economic and social issues from the First Republic. In May 1961, General Park Chung-hee led a military coup, overthrowing the democratic government and establishing military rule. The single year of the Second Republic was the only time South Korea was run as a parliamentary democracy. Park Chung-hee initially ruled as a military dictator. In 1963, he issued a new constitution, transitioning to a civilian presidency, but maintained tight control over the government. Park implemented state-led industrialization and export-oriented economic policies, focusing on heavy industries like steel, shipbuilding, and electronics. Chaebols, large family-owned conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai, drove rapid economic growth. By the 1970s, South Korea began transitioning from a low to middle-income country, able to compete with Japan. But the cost was high. Under the Yushin Constitution, political dissent was suppressed and civil liberties were curtailed, granting Park near absolute power. Growing unrest over political repression and economic inequality led to tensions. The culmination was Park's assassination by his intelligence chief. After Park's death, South Korea experienced political uncertainty, with short-lived leadership before yet another military coup. Following the coup by Chun Doo-hwan, protests erupted in Gwangju, demanding democratization. But the military brutally suppressed the uprising, with estimates from hundreds to thousands killed. Chun established authoritarian rule in 1980, suppressing dissent while continuing economic modernization. South Korea achieved significant progress, hosting international events like the 1988 Seoul Olympics, but public discontent over repression persisted. In June 1987, massive protests forced Chun to agree to constitutional amendments, leading to direct presidential elections. Reforms marked the return to civilian rule and the start of South Korea's Sixth Republic, establishing a more democratic system with direct presidential elections, a system which remains fragile, but still continues. President Kim Dae-jung promoted reconciliation with North Korea through the Sunshine Policy, earning him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2000, but the fate of the Korean peninsula still remains a mystery. The small island of Taiwan, also had been part of the Japanese Empire since the First Sino-Japanese War in the late 1800s, but the Republic of China assumed control in 1945 with the end of World War II. With the Japanese defeated, the truce between the Republic of China and Communists dissipated, and the Civil War resumed. Many native Taiwanese, the vast majority ethnic Han Chinese, but also a small minority of indigenous Austronesians, who had lived under Japanese colonial rule, resented the Chinese administration's authoritarian governance and corruption, as they confiscated resources for China's war effort against the Chinese Communist Party. This culminated in the February 28 incident. A local protest escalated into a mass uprising, and the KMT brutally suppressed the rebellion, killing tens of thousands, creating a lasting sense of alienation from mainland Chinese rule. Though the World War was over, the KMT's war with Mao's People's Liberation Army continued until they were driven off the mainland in 1949. After fleeing to Taiwan, the Republic of China established Taipei as its capital, continuing to claim sovereignty over all of China, vowing to unify the mainland again.
General Chiang Kai-shek returns to power as president of nationalist China. He takes office in exile at Formosa, island fortress 90 miles from the Chinese mainland. The Generalissimo, here with his wife, predicts that the communists who control the mainland will not last long.
With the communist Chinese posing an existential threat to their government, the KMT declared martial law, which lasted until 1987, the longest period of martial law in the world, 38 years. Opposition leaders were arrested, and suspected communists and pro-independence activists were executed in this long period called the White Terror. With significant US economic and military aid during the Cold War, Taiwan focused on export-driven industrialization, transitioning from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing hub. During the 60s and 70s, Taiwan experienced rapid economic growth, earning its place as one of Asia's tigers, alongside South Korea and two others we will get to later. In 1971, the People's Republic of China replaced the ROC in the United Nations, and many countries switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. The US established formal ties with the PRC in 1979, but maintained unofficial relations with Taiwan through the Taiwan Relations Act, ensuring continued security and economic ties. Ironically, Taiwan maintained more Chinese traditions than on the mainland. Many old Chinese treasures were evacuated to the island, and while the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution reshaped the mainland, Taiwan became a refuge for traditional Chinese religions, including Confucianism, Taoism, and Chinese Buddhism. Temples, rituals, and festivals were maintained and even flourished, such as the Lunar New Year and Dragon Boat and Ghost festivals. Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975, just a year before his greatest rival, Chairman Mao, and martial law was lifted in 1987 by Chiang Ching-kuo, his son and successor, marking the beginning of Taiwan's democratization. The Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, was a center-left party founded in 1986, becoming the main opposition to the center-right KMT, advocating for democratic reforms and, later, independence. Taiwan continued its economic growth, focusing on technology and innovation, becoming a leader in semiconductors and electronics. Education expanded, and living standards improved, with Taiwan ranking high in health, literacy, and quality of life. In 2000, Chen Shui-bian of the DPP was elected president, ending more than 50 years of KMT dominance.
台湾人民绝大多数的声音，大家认为台湾是一个主权独立的国家，中华民国也是一个主权独立的国家。我们不是中华人民共和国的一省或者它的一部分。
China viewed Chen's pro-independence stance as provocative, leading to military threats and strained relations. But despite these political tensions, economic ties between Taiwan and China grew significantly, with Taiwanese businesses investing heavily in China. Though the nationalists came back to power shortly, the DPP has had a resurgence in the recent decade. Relations with China have since deteriorated again under the DPP presidency as they seek full sovereignty. Taiwan faces increasing international isolation due to China's diplomatic efforts, but it has strengthened ties with key partners like the United States, Japan, and European states. Taiwan remains a global leader in semiconductors, with companies like TSMC critical to global supply chains. The economy has shifted toward high-tech industries, such as AI, biotech, and green energy. The Taiwan Strait has become a geopolitical flashpoint, with growing US-China tensions over Taiwan's status. What do you think the fate of this island will be? While Taiwan and South Korea initially developed under protection from the United States, the two smallest of the Asian tigers, Singapore and Hong Kong, had been British colonies. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia and became an independent republic. It was underdeveloped, consisting mainly of marshlands and dense jungle. Facing limited resources, Singapore pursued an export-oriented economy, leveraging its strategic location as a trading hub. The government attracted foreign investment and emphasized rapid industrialization.
I am calculating not in terms of the next election, that's no trouble, 68, no trouble. I am calculating in terms of the next generation, in terms of the next 100 years, in terms of eternity. And believe you me, the next 1,000 years, we will be here.
The Centre-Right People's Action Party, under Lee Kuan Yew, established a dominant party state with strict control over political dissent and media. Policies focused on efficiency, as massive public housing projects, universal education, and the development of industries like electronics and petrochemicals, transformed Singapore into a high-income country. They excelled in finance, shipping, technology, and developed into a global financial center and hub for multinational corporations. As with the other tigers, Singapore adopted a more authoritarian and centralized style of governance, based on Confucian values of hierarchy and obedience. Laws were known for being quite strict, and penalties include corporal punishment by caning and capital punishment by hanging. But as Singapore had prospered economically, many wealthier citizens wished for more freedoms. Lee Kuan Yew's successor, Goh Chok Tong, became Prime Minister in 1990, promising a relaxation of harsh restrictions, but in recent years, the PAP, the only ruling party since Singapore's independence, has been on the decline. Nonetheless, Singapore has been such an economic success that its wealth per capita is the highest in Asia, and its total GDP is ranked third of all ASEAN members, despite its tiny size and population. Unlike Singapore, Hong Kong remained under British administration. The Japanese occupation had left its infrastructure and economy in ruins. But refugees from mainland China, fleeing the civil war and communist rule, contributed to a population boom and labor force growth.
Down below us is the business center of the island section of Hong Kong, and across the bay is the Kowloon section.
In World War II, the British lost Hong Kong after less than 3 weeks of fighting. No one today gives it much more than 3 days, if the Chinese communists ever decide to take it. Hong Kong is a tiny island that huddles a few miles off the coast of China. The Chinese wanted it long before Mao Zedong, who lets the British flag remain there because the communists like to keep it as a trading post, a listening post, a sort of Asiatic Switzerland.
Hong Kong became a center for light manufacturing, like textiles and plastics, and trade. Unlike the other tigers, which had state-guided economies, Hong Kong's British administration promoted a more free market economy, which flourished due to its export-driven manufacturing sector. Their cheap labor, favorable tax policies, and free trade policies attracted investment, while the British authorities improved housing, healthcare, and education to accommodate the growing population. Despite occasional labor unrest, British rule maintained political stability and suppressed pro-communist movements. When China opened up in the late 70s, many manufacturers moved to the mainland, and Hong Kong shifted to become China's financial gateway. Like Singapore, the city developed a robust banking and stock market system, attracting international businesses. In the 1980s, Britain and China negotiated Hong Kong's future. It was agreed that Hong Kong would be handed back to China in 1997 under the One Country, Two Systems framework. On July 1, 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China, but retained a high degree of autonomy for 50 years under the Two Systems principle. Hong Kong would preserve its capitalist economy and legal system. Over time, Beijing's increasing influence and limited democratic reforms led to mass protests, including the Umbrella Movement in 2014, demanding universal suffrage, and more recent protests against a proposed extradition bill, which evolved into broader pro-democracy demonstrations. Beijing imposed the national security law in 2020, restricting dissent and consolidating its control over Hong Kong. Though these East Asian nations have flourished in the economic sphere, there remains political nervousness with other powers in the region. Apart from Hong Kong's political tensions with China, Taiwan also straddles the line as part of China, but is recognized as an independent state by a dozen nations worldwide. South Korea, too, continues to face deep divisions with their northern neighbors, as relations enter another period of deterioration.